Hi again, everybody, and welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And we're in Genesis part 113. That's the 113th episode of season 2 of this amazing journey through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And I've called this study and the few that we're going to be doing in Genesis chapter 15, considering together the reliability of God. And today we're going to jump straight in and pick up the conversation between Abraham and God. And I'll just remind you of that conversation in those couple of verses that we closed out the last study with, which is Genesis 15, verses 2 and 3, which says this: "But Abraham said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abraham said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.'" Okay, so what does that mean? The Lord has already told Abraham that he was going to give him descendants, and therefore he was going to give him a son. Abraham appears to be saying, you've already promised something, but it hasn't come through yet. So Abraham then he almost says to God, let me make a suggestion. I have a servant over here, Eliezer, this guy in Damascus, and at the moment, he's my heir. Why don't we just let that stand and let him become the heir? I mean, you promised me an heir, but I'm an old man, Abraham says, so let him be the substitute, because you haven't seen fit to give me a son by natural means. Actually, what Abraham is suggesting isn't that far-fetched according to the customs of the day. It was appropriate for a man that if he died wealthy and he didn't have a son, that he would leave his wealth to a specially chosen or selected servant. So Abraham is simply, as he sees it, trying to help God out. He's trying to help God out of what he thinks is an impossible situation by suggesting something that would have been the norm at that time. However, Abraham had forgotten that God had promised him an heir by natural means, a natural-born heir. So this solution that Abraham is offering doesn't really fit the bill at all. This doesn't fulfill the original promise that God had made in any way. So the issue now is one of Abraham questioning the promise of God, the covenant that he made, in a sense asking, how good are the promises of God? Well, that's interesting. So let's just take a moment now and read what God's response is to Abraham's suggestion. Verses 4 and 5 says, "Then the Lord God said to him," and this is God speaking to Abraham, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside, that's God taking Abraham outside, and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." So God, in a sense, says, well, thank you for your suggestion, Abraham. Nice try, but that won't work. That won't do it at all. That's not what I've promised at all, and that's not what we're going to settle for here. I told you that you're going to have an heir, and he's going to come about by natural means. Let me remind you of what I have already said, what I have already promised. So at this point in the narrative, it's clearly now night time. So God says, come outside, Abraham. I want to show you something. Look up at the skies, he says. You see the stars up there? Can you count them? Now, when you're in the Middle East, or I had the privilege of visiting part of Kenya many years back where there was no light pollution, so we can't really get a sense of this in the West. But he goes to this dark place, which the Middle East would have been there with no natural lighting, and he says to Abraham, look up in the sky and count the stars up there. That's how your descendants are going to be, as numerous as the stars of the heaven. Remember the promise that God had made to Abraham back in chapter 13? God is simply repeating it here in Genesis 15:5. And God is again promising Abraham innumerable descendants to the point where he can't even count them. The first illustration God used a couple of chapters ago was granules of sand on the beach, but this time it's the stars in the heaven. two illustrations, a promise and a recommitment of that promise, both using illustrations to impress upon to Abraham the fact that the descendants are going to be beyond anything he can count, perhaps even anything he can even imagine. Now, the next verse, chapter 15, verse 6, is one of the most important verses in the whole book of Genesis. One of the most important verses in the Old Testament. Some might say one of the most important verses in the whole Bible. And it's that verse we look at next time. So thank you for joining me. I'd remind you that there's always a transcript available of any of these talks. The easiest place to find it is in the episode notes of any audio version of the podcast. But you also should be able to find it if you click around through either the YouTube or the Facebook posting. But that's it for this time. And I look forward to us coming together again very soon on the Daily Bible Project podcast. Bye for now.